Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Crime Centric. This being a show where I talk about crime dramas that I watch. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Prodigal Son. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. I do love the opening with, Martin having that dream and everything, and I love that it's like, and I expected it to go full-blown nightmare immediately, where he's like, I was like, oh, he's dreaming because Jessica's there, and he's like, oh, I'm home and whatnot, and I was like, oh, she's gonna like pull out a gun and shoot you or something like that, and it's like, no, she's like, oh, hey, honey, here's a drink, and then like, oh, I want to have sex with you, and he's like, well, blah, 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 he's like really getting into it, and then Malcolm's sitting over there kind of sullen, he's like, what, you don't have anything to say to your father? It's like, yeah, but you know this is all a dream, right? That this isn't real, like, the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, saying like it's a delusion because you don't think it's actually going to be that easy to kind of worm your way back into this family, do you? Wake up, Martin. And then he wakes up and he's just like, that kid is such a killjoy. I'm like, I love that because it's just like, it's like you won't even let me. I can't even like, it's like you take the thrill out of everything in real life because I don't get to just bask and enjoy the fact that my son's a quote unquote killer, that you're so much like me. I don't get to bask in that enjoyment. You kind of take that away from me. Even in my dreams, like what I want, you take that away from me too. But in particular, this episode was really interesting also because it gave us a lot of insight into Malcolm. We learned, like, obviously this case takes him back to the academy he went to. It wasn't even an academy he necessarily wanted to. It was more so like his mom kind of positioned him into that. And this is also the origin of him taking the name Bright and not wanting to be Whitley, And this also showed you that, this is at a point in time where he still had a complicated yet still manageable, I guess, relationship with his dad, because this was in like 2005. But I love that, like, Gil's like, okay, there's a murder here, and Bright's like, yeah, I'm not going. He's like, what if I told you I knew? She's like, well, if you told me the victim was the headmaster, wow, I guess this is my lucky day. And because Bright was like, wow, he didn't legitimately think it was going to end up being the headmaster, and it is. And just going back there has a whole bunch of bad memories. Obviously, we get the little side plot about JT flipping out and stressing because, like, oh, like, his wife is like, the baby was supposed to come like a day ago, so she's like a day over, like, giving birth. And I love Idrissa being like, when's the last time they had sex? When's the last time she gave him an orgasm? When's the last time he gave his wife an orgasm? Ask that. And then he's just like, only looking like, I'm not going to ask that. It's just like, huh. And just Gil has to be like, Idrissa, get back to everything. It's like, okay. So her kind of enjoying the whole thing, even being like, man, I kind of wish we would have been able to leave the body there because the whole thing was kind of like, because obviously at this school they do pranks and stuff like that. It was definitely sinister when they walk up and, Gil was like, yeah, the students were told to stay inside, and just those students staring out at Bright. It's like, this school. Once again, we had like a demon possession episode last time, and it just almost has that creepy, I guess, Omen vibe, and to a certain extent in this as well. So that's where just my mind went. But we also learned in this episode that Bright's hand trimmer, this school is actually where that started, because he was telling Danny, like, no, it's not, this wasn't a condition I was born with. It came about later on in life. I never thought about it too much. I just assumed it was just related to all the trauma. I mean, to be fair, we've seen Malcolm when he was younger, not just like, when he was in school, as a kid when his dad got arrested, but older, because obviously he would actually visit his dad over the years until up to a certain point. But it's like, it never crossed my mind to think, like, right, he didn't have the trimmers back then. I mean, granted, we were only getting like little snippets here and there, but now we kind of found out what it was about. This kid found out who he really was because, it's like, oh, you're Malcolm Whitley. Locked him in a closet, and he stayed in there for 3 whole days because it was like over the weekend or whatever, and no one found out, and he stayed in there, no food, no water, and everything. I was like, and it's also where his fear of him being claustrophobic came about, too. I think ironically enough, considering, like, well, I say ironic just because, like, Eve's sister ended up being locked in the trunk and everything, so, like, that's why I'm like, it's just interesting that he would ultimately end up being claustrophobic to us, considering everything too. But it's like, that's enough to like make you go, yeah, that's a very traumatizing thing. Also, it literally, they give the answer in the episode, but I was like, whatever happened to Nikki? Like, I was almost halfway expecting Malcolm to run into Nikki, but I was like, is Nikki not around? Did something happen? I'm curious to find out about that. We probably won't get any answers because it's probably not that important, but I'm still he kind of screwed Malcolm over psychologically in many different ways, because not only did he do that, but he's also the reason why the principal ended up finding out about Malcolm. Well, not the principal, the headmaster. It's the same thing. But finding out about Malcolm actually being Malcolm Whitley and his dad being a sergeant and everything. So, but part of me was like, oh, whatever, happened to Darrow Nikki, because you kind of wanted him to get some justice. You were almost hoping for like an opportunity to kind of deal with his trauma. I mean, granted, the entire episode's kind of built around that. But then Malcolm remembers that there's the principal, I keep doing that, the headmaster had a black book that he wrote down students' names in. These were people he was expelling. And Malcolm jumps in the pool to get it. Obviously, the other students get 3 students in particular get gathered up. They're the ones whose names were on the most recent page, and Malcolm's dripping wet, and it's like, wants to, psychoanalyze all of them, and it's like, he kind of breaks them down by thinking like, oh, you have no empathy, you're paranoid, and you, I forgot what he said about, it's either, I kept doing it, getting it wrong in my head. I think it's Luis, but it might be Luisa, but I think it's just Luis, but, each one of them be like, oh, we're not friends or whatever, but Malcolm's like, these kids are lying. Now, whether they're murderers or not, that's a whole other thing, but it's like, they're definitely lying. They're in on something. And obviously, because the case is complicated, I meant to talk about this being kind of like, this is all messed up in its own right, because Jessica shows up, because it turns out she's the one that called in some favors to basically get them on this case, to get Malcolm on the case. It's like, why would you do that? It's like, well, because if I had the whole thing, if I came to you, she's like, this need to be handled delicately, because if you just straight up asked him, he would have said no. And he's like, I'm even thinking of saying no right now, because for her, she's like, I get you have issues with this school, but obviously she's like, she's on like the board or something like that. So like her family, like, has ties to the school, and for her, it's like, if it comes out about a murder at the school, it's not going to be long until my name gets dragged in, because I guess she's kind of like a silent partner, like off on the side, because she probably, if she does use her name, it's obviously most likely her maiden name. So, because that was a thing in season 1, was her trying to distance herself from the whole Whitley situation, trying to be her own, because obviously, like, amongst the high society folks, she still kind of got like that, like, stare and stink of like, that's his wife. It's that thing of like, oh, how much does she know? Did she really not know? There's no way she didn't know that her husband had killed like 20 some people. It was that whole thing. So I think this was kind of preserving that legacy, because she had made a point of that last season about, I did a lot before I married Martin, so not all that should be tarnished because of Martin, and I won't let him tarnish it. So I think it kind of flows in that aspect as well. Granted, it makes things a little awkward with Gil. He's like, I thought you said you want to kind of have nothing to do with me. She's like, that was just on a personal level. This is professional. We can separate the two. And Gil just kind of walks away. I'm like, yeah, because not only did you use Malcolm to a certain extent, you used him as well, especially because the complicated thing going on between you two right now. But after they started like interrogating those kids, or rather just kind of, trying to figure them out, Jessica came in and being like, oh, those 3 students, they wouldn't do anything. It's like, because she's immediately like, Malcolm, your personal experiences are clouding your judgment. And he's like, your judgment's kind of being clouded in this, that you're not willing to see things the way they are. He's like, I'm sorry, I didn't want to come to this school, that you kind of set this whole situation up in the first place. But, I love that as that scene's happening, Adrisa is literally getting ganged up on by kids. This episode just reaffirms the thing that we all know. Kids are assholes. Kids are little shits that you're like, it's moments like that where you're like, you want to be a kid so you can kick another kid's ass. Because you're like, oh, you're such a little shit. But these are, I granted, this is the most extreme version of like, you are literally, because they were like, oh, what are you, a student or something? And she's like, no. And then like, was it Luisa, like ends up punching her? I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with you? You're attacking a medical examiner, you pieces of shit? What is wrong with you ganging up on her like that? I was like, don't you do that to Teresa, you pieces of crap. But it turns out they were protective because like, turns out they're cheating and they didn't want to get caught. And now this also ties into like the guy that, which that actor, I've seen him, I think Royal Pains is the thing I kind of know him best from, but obviously he's popped up in other stuff too, I believe. But Royal Pains is kind of the thing that immediately comes to mind with that actor. He was a guy that Malcolm, he was like, oh, I've kept an eye on Malcolm. I know how he works. And it's like, you do whatever you got to do, Malcolm. Like, he seemed like the one person at the school Malcolm seemed like he had a decent relationship with. But he's like, I forgot what sparked that conversation. Oh, right, because Malcolm was wondering, like, after all these years, I need to know who told the headmaster? Well, it wasn't just the headmaster. It was like, who told Nikki about me and my real name, being Whitley? And it's like, well, your dad did. And Malcolm confronts his dad, because I think for him, it's like, you wanted to, confront, just because, I am nothing like you. And he's like, oh, we both know that's not true, son. But he's like, yes, wasn't too happy about you going to that school, but it's like, I would never do anything to harm you because you are my boy. Like, once again, in his twisted way, he does love Malcolm, and he's trying to be there for Malcolm, even though Malcolm's not necessarily dealing with things. It's like, I want you to deal with things, because he's like, I think in his mind, it's like, if you just let go, if you just embraced it, you'd be a lot, but you're here torturing yourself about it. It's like, let it go, embrace it, because he wants Malcolm to be a lot more like him, because it's like, it's already there, you're just denying it. But I think he's trying to slowly ease Malcolm into it. He's not trying to, but from time to time, it seems like they're just trying to throw him into the deep end, but he is trying to slowly acclimate Malcolm to like the notion of like, no, like, it isn't just me, you're my boy, and I love you and I care for you. It might seem weird and twisted in my own way, but it is my own way. But then it turns out, no, it wasn't his dad, because he's like, yeah, he studied his dad enough, analyzed his dad enough to know when he's lying. So in fact, it was home dude that told him, like, oh, your dad. It's like, no, it was you. And it's like, why'd you do that? And it's like, because he was running this cheating ring. He has been this entire time. And Malcolm, being as observant as he was, it's like he had to get rid of Malcolm, because it was like, which is so messed up, considering like he makes it so like, oh yeah, Malcolm, I'm so proud of you. I was trying to defend you when the principal kicked you out. It's like, you're the one who orchestrated the whole thing, because for him, it's like, this school, the rich and powerful, they have a future beyond this. Like, no matter what happens, they can cheat away whatever their legacies. They have jobs and a future and a life waiting for them. It's like, for him, it's like, I'm stuck at this school, so why don't I kind of benefit from the situation as well? Obviously, like, yeah, Luis kind of pointing it towards like dude that was in the trio, end up sending the cops after him, but it turns out like him and the other girl is like, yeah, we're there. It seems like they're a couple, or at the very least, it's them against Luis, because she's the one because Malcolm was saying like, she's kind of the brains of the operation, but he didn't really believe she was a killer. But it's like, maybe because of his own bias in his circumstances and this situation, he wasn't able to see her kind of who she really was, because to a certain extent, it's like, because she was very good at hiding it, but also she was very similar to him. Obviously, she just poisoned home dude, kind of tying up any loose ends, locking Malcolm in that room where they would eventually, home dude would die from the poison. And Malcolm would eventually die from the air. But it's like, there's commonality, because for her, it's like, she's not doing all this to get into a great school necessarily, because like, that's all that's a matter. It's like, oh, your dad's pressuring you and to be perfect. It's like, no, I'm doing this not for him. I'm doing this to get away from him. And it's like, which Malcolm can understand. He did the exact same thing. And he was able to kind of he was able to use that to his advantage by being like, yeah, we're actually kind of similar. It's like, you killed someone to get away from your dad, and it's like, but no matter, even if you get away from your dad, it doesn't change things. He's speaking from experience. Like, your dad will always be a part of you, and you will be a killer. It's like, I'm a killer too. And I was like, are you going to at first, when he was like biting his time, I thought like, is he recording her confession or something? I wasn't sure what he was doing. And so I was like, at first I was like, whoa, are you going to talk about the account thing? It's like, oh no, you're not. You're talking about the whole situation with Nikki, which he ended up getting his revenge, which you're kind of like, oh shit, snap. Because you almost didn't expect that from Malcolm, but to be fair, this was like a younger Malcolm, and it's like, hey, and then like punched a dude, like, and his asthma kicked in, and it's like, oh, you're looking for your inhaler? It's here, but it's empty, and Malcolm was just standing over him, and it's like, oh, like, yeah, she's like, yeah, you probably couldn't tell him when, dads, they wouldn't be, they're judgmental. He's like, actually, not mine. Mine would actually have been proud. My dad's a serial killer, so, yeah, I always having to throw that caveat in. It's like, yeah, my circumstances aren't the same as everyone else's, but at the end of the day, he didn't do that, because he was like, I'm not my father. I'm not going to let who my father is control who I am. So in that moment, he called for help. So once again, we still don't know what happened to Nikki. I don't think Nikki died, because he did save him, but the way the conversation went, but we don't know where Nikki is present day. But other than that, because he was even saying, like, that's how the headmaster knew to a certain extent. Like, he knew, like, that's why I got suspended, because he saw the killer that I was. He saw in that what I did in that moment. It made that, it was kind of like, so it was like, not like Malcolm was like unjustly kicked out because like Malcolm never tells the full story, like what he did to Nikki. So it's like that show like, oh, you do have a lot more of your father in you than you'd ever admit, than you'd ever want other people to see. So it's a little more justified in like why he ended up getting expelled. So maybe I wouldn't assume his mom knows the full story either. Maybe she does, but because maybe that's why she's a little more like okay about the school than like Malcolm is. Maybe she realizes what he went through, but at the same time, it's like, because our reason for sending him there now in the grand scheme of things, it makes sense, is because I'm sure it was to kind of reconnect with the family, her side of the family more so, like the legacy of like, oh, like her family has kind of been a part of that school for generations. So I think it was once again separating from the Whitley side of things. But yeah, at the end of the day, they ended up catching Lisa because he ended up starting a fire that set off some alarms. And even then she was like, yeah, you got me. It was like, oh, the fire alarm? Yeah, it's just, there's no fire. It's just a prank. It's like, you were about to make sure that Malcolm died. Because I guess it's like, she did all that confessing to him. So if he was still alive, that'd be a whole issue. Plus, home dude's dying from the poison you gave him. So it's like, you know, she was trying to everything to work to her advantage. But I love Gil kind of giving the third grade. He's like, really a minute? Come on, Gil. Like, I get it. Like, yeah, I did this and that, but we caught, you know, Lise. And it's like, yeah, and you almost died. He's like, yeah, but it all worked out in the end. And it's like, hey, look, baby JT. Oh, it's so adorable. It's like, well, at least some good came about, you know, everything. So, and you also had Malcolm showing up later and apologizing. He's like, I accused you of something you didn't do. And he was like, oh. He's like, I honestly didn't expect. He was like, I'm not going to apologize for anything. He's like, son, just let me hold on to this one moment. Just let me hold on to it. But it's like, you know, I will always be your father. And he's like, trust me, I can never forget. But it's like, hey, let's squeeze in some other time. Like, you know, you didn't get my help with this case. You could have come to me sooner. But it's like, hey, you know, slowly building that bridge up. Like, I think this was therapeutic for Malcolm to a certain extent, but it also made him see kind of like how, I guess for him, it's like I was lashing out at him. And yeah, I have a lot of issues with Dr. Whitley, but it's like this ended up not really being one of them. This was kind of someone else's fault, and I can't really blame. Yeah, I can blame you for other stuff that's actually your fault, but I can't blame you for something that you didn't actually do and you weren't a part of. So it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. And then on the other side of things, let's focus on the Dr. Whitley side of things. Obviously, he's a part of the, you know, the Bible study group, and it's just like, oh, Pete, what about getting out of here? It's like, talk to Daryl, and it's like, all right, Daryl, how are we going to do this whole situation? And it's like, well, I got the key. Well, he's talking about someone else got the key cards. It's like, oh, really? Who's that? And he points to the empty chair, and it's like, you have Martin looking like, oh, okay, wow, this guy is crazy. And then it's like, well, he's like, because you basically the way the security systems is set up at the place, it's like, well, you need 3 different key cards, and no one particular guard has all 3 cards. Luckily, Daryl already did the legwork and has got 2. Now they just need to find someone with the red card. Turns out Mr. David's one of those people. And Daryl's like, all right, well, Martin had been like, well, give me your shiv because I can kill him. It's like, oh yeah, he's crazy enough to actually think, you know, he likes to believe, well, we're close enough that he actually thinks we're friends, which I was kind of like, really? But then like the way he's acting later on, it's like, oh, it's because I think for you it's advantageous not to kill Mr. David because it's just going to complicate your situation more. But more so than anything, I think it's also because what you were saying, he thought you were friends. Is like, he's kind of a friend to you. He's kind of the only friend you have. So like they have the rapport and everything. So there is a bond that Martin kind of has with him, whether he really admit it or not. Because I think I'm sure there are other extenuating circumstances, but I just can't help but feel like that's the main reason why you didn't kill him. Just also because it's like you do like him and you care for him. So, and even because that was something he was trying to talk to Malcolm about. It's like, that's what makes me complicated because yeah, I might have done these evil and terrible things, but I do have a good side of me. So that makes it a little complicated. Like he's still the vile sociopath, you know, narcissistic serial killer that he is, but he does have his good moments because you can make the argument though, but you could also say like, well, it's, you know, going by good place standards, it doesn't get him any points towards going to the good place because he did it for selfish reasons potentially. Like his reason for doing good was coming from a very selfish place because it's like, well, he probably thought about in the long run of like keeping Mr. David alive could actually benefit him rather than this will be just going for, you know, getting the card now, but it's like he's thinking steps ahead about, you know, what the future entails and how this could all play out. So he ended up turning on Daryl and kind of getting him, and he's like, oh, you better watch your back, surgeon. So that's interesting. So I'm curious to see how Martin gets right. I mean, granted, he now has the 2 key cards, and now is this like a one-off, like, oh, only one person can get out at a time? So is it only Martin that's going to get out, or is like all of them going to get out? Like, I was under the assumption Pete was kind of setting it up so like him, Martin, and others could get away. Maybe that is still the plan, but he's probably going to try and find another way around getting that card from Mr. David. And maybe Malcolm will play a role in that. So maybe that's another reason, kind of mending fences with your son a little bit, because he's necessary for whatever plan you're concocting. So a lot of interesting things. I'm curious to ultimately see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.